Cool.
I'm doing a very special interview today with Dr. Claudie Massicotte, whose book, Trance Speakers, Femininity and Authorship in Spiritual Seances, 1850 to 1930, I have had the pleasure of reading multiple times in multiple ways, partly because she married me a while ago. And so this is a different interview than I would normally do. But thank you very much for being on the show, Dr. Massicotte.
Thank you very much. I've heard a lot about your podcast, so it's an honor.
I wish you would listen to my podcast sometimes, but I'm glad you've heard some things. I do want to have a somewhat serious conversation about your book. Why don't you maybe start by telling people how you became interested in seances and spiritualism?
Mm-hmm. When I was doing my PhD in Canada, and that's where you and I met, I was really interested in the question of women's authorship, especially in the 19th century. And I was studying their different approaches to authorship, for instance, through thematic writing and other practices that weren't the traditional authorship practices that we usually think about when we think about writing and literature. And this is how I encountered the spiritualist movement, the stories of possessions that many 19th century women were talking about and discussing. And so I became really interested in what do women do when they feel possessed? How do they speak through possession? What do they say? How do they write? And how might this affect modern ideas about agency, authorship, writing, collaboration, etc.? So this was the main interest that I had beginning this research. And then as I continued, I realized that no historical research had been done in Canada on particularly women spiritualists or female mediums. And so that's why it became the topic of this book.
For people that might not be as familiar with spiritualism, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about spiritualism?
Spiritualism is a movement that, as we know it in Western society, spiritualism originated in 1848 with two female mediums who were sisters. Their names were Kate and Margaret Fox, and they lived in Hitsville, New York. And what happened is in 1848, there's even a specific date, March 31st, 1848, they heard or they reported hearing knocks on their family home, knocks that they attributed to spirits. And they started asking questions to these knocks and allegedly heard responses. And so the sisters very rapidly became a sensation in Hitsville, near Rochester. So they started having seances in their own homes and later on in public spaces and the homes of other families. And very soon, about 2 years after that, they instigated the spiritualist movement, and it became a very famous spiritual religious movement in the United States and abroad, in Canada, in Europe, in England, in France, Germany, etc. A lot of mediums began to allegedly develop their powers and to hold seances as well abroad.
So this obviously could be a religious studies text or a history text, but I think it definitely fits into critical theory and cultural studies. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach this phenomenon?
Yes. So most mediums in the 19th century were women. And if they were not women, they were often described through a feminine lexicon or lexical field where authors would talk about mediums as often passive bodies, therefore feminine bodies in the vocabulary of the time, that could more easily transmit the voices of the dead. And so just to give an example, there were a lot of tests, for instance, that were done with mediums to demonstrate that they were allegedly the channels for the voices of the dead. And a lot of these tests involved waxing politically or eloquently about politics or mathematics or these kinds of fields where women were not necessarily inclined to or be taught to know about. So a lot of the studies of spiritual mediumships that have been done looked at this historically. So they looked at the practice to see what happened when women did become mediums and were believed to be channeling the voices of dead spirits, often dead male spirits. And what these historians and religious scholars found is that these women very often gained an advantage. So they were listened to more carefully. When they were holding public seances, they were perceived as spiritual leaders. They were perceived as knowledgeable subjects. Of course, it wasn't them, but the ideas that they voiced were being carefully listened to. So I think this would be what you mean by a historical or religious study of the movement. For me, what I was interested in was what happens to the question of authorship or the notion of agency when these women are possessed. And so I've read a lot of critical theory, particularly I've read psychoanalytic studies of the subject and feminist criticism to understand what happens in spiritual or possession discourses, what happens to the subject.
When you're approaching this through historical documents and through other various recollections, I guess, what have you found most helpful in terms of a theoretical framework?
I found that Lucy Ray Gray was very helpful to me as a framework to study spiritual mediumship. She has a lot of writings on women's voices. Her studies use linguistic, psychoanalysis, and religious studies as well. So she's very interesting. For me, she was very interesting to frame this study. In particular, she has an essay called La Mystérique, where she's linking the discourses of the hysteric and the mystique. And she uses this as an exemplar of women's possibilities of authorship. And what she's discovered through her linguistic studies is that women have much more difficulty than men, or at least within her studies, it seemed that women had much more difficulty than men to voice the pronoun subject I. And so in her linguistic studies, women had difficulty saying sentences like, I use this pencil. If you asked two subjects, a male and a female, to use words like pencil or with or these different kinds of things, a male subject would often say, I use this pencil, I go to the bar with my friend, these kinds of things. Whereas women would say, is this your pencil? Would you like to come with me? So the responsibility of the utterance was very often left to another. And that to me was very interesting when studying the discourses of mediumship, which refuses the authorial position. In a way, it's as if the female mediums refused to assume a subject position. They had to erase themselves. But by doing that, they also found a way to pronounce a discourse of power, a discourse of knowledge, where this I, this subject, became a confident, authoritative voice.
So I know that you've had the experience of going to a number of different libraries and archives. Luckily, I've gotten to travel with you to a few of them. So I know that you've been to Paris, Geneva, the Toronto Reference Library, among others. When you're looking at authors, especially when it comes to mediumship, how have you found that experience? Because, I mean, if somebody is being a medium for a famous personality, does that personality become the author, or is the medium the author? Or I know in some cases people would be transcribing the words being said by the woman who was also supposed to be saying it for another, potentially a celebrity or something. How has that translated into your research and archival work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a scholar named Helen Schmitt who talks about this a little bit in her book, Ghostwriting Modernism. And what she says is that mediumship and spiritualism in the 19th and 20th century really initiated a debate in librarian practices and cataloging practices in particular. So how do we attribute authorship to these mediums who were claiming, for instance, to write automatically and to transmit the voice of Oscar Wilde, for instance? Do we attribute the authorship to Oscar Wilde, to this unknown woman, to the transcribers of these discourses? For instance, in the seances, sometimes the books were written through knockings and raps on the table. So all of these really changed librarian practices at the time. In my personal experience, I would say that it made it sometimes difficult to find these writings by women authors, female mediums, because there are still libraries, for instance, the Toronto Library, the archival collections that we visited had the author of the two books that I saw that I wanted to study were attributed to the spirit. The spirit was considered the author of the text, and so it was a little bit difficult to retrieve it and to find who wrote it, who was this woman, find any kind of biographical detail about this woman, because the preface was written by a man, a scientific man who had a reputation. The writing itself was attributed to a spirit. And so in this whole process of editorship and publication and archival documentation, the woman was completely erased.
It's interesting too, because like you said, a lot of the cases involve some kind of scientific man, authority figure looking into this mediumship. I'm wondering how you found yourself as an author writing about this, how you've experienced, the reception of this book, especially talking to maybe peers or colleagues, maybe at a conference or whatever. Because to me, it seems like if you were to say that you're studying mediumship in a way that you are completely devout to it and believe in it, you would get some very strange looks perhaps at a conference. But at the same time, if you're talking about it in certain ways as a professional, as a scholar, you may distance yourself so much that people are wondering how it is you relate. And so I'm wondering what kind of reactions you get when you say that you, as a scholar in English literature, philosophy, and related disciplines, are studying mediumship. What kind of reaction do you get, and how do you think that plays a role in your research?
I would respond to these questions in two ways. The first way, how did it feel to write this book about female mediums? I always think about Virginia Woolf's idea that a woman writing always think through her mothers. A woman writing always thinks through her mothers. And Virginia Woolf at the time was saying that the lives of these mothers still need to be uncovered. And so for me, I really enjoyed adopting this position. I considered it, through my writing, a position of the mediums, where I was searching for these voices that had been forgotten or erased from histories, partly because they chose to be erased in these discourses, because they chose to attribute their own discourses to others. And so partly for me, this was interesting to hold this position of being the medium, being the one who would be able to transmit these voices to others, hopefully. The second part of this question that you ask, I think, has to do with how did I approach this subject and how do I describe this subject to others as well? How is it received by others today? And I find this very interesting. Most books written by historians, sociologists, religious studies scholars tend to not put their own judgment into the spiritualist practices, which I completely agree with in one sense. So what they will do, most writers, most historians of spiritualism, is that they will not make a judgment upon whether the voice of the spirits were invented, created by these female mediums, or whether there were really spirits entering the seance room. And my approach is a little bit different because I wanted to say that these voices reflected something specific about the unconscious of these women. So by definition, by wanting to look at spiritual possession as a complex form of agency and authorship, I had to refuse the spiritualist explanation of the movement. But I think that this was more interesting, at least to me, because it made possible answering certain questions about what does possession say about women's agency at a time where they were attributed very little agency. So what other ways, what oblique ways could they find to discourse, to be listened to have a legitimate claim to authorship? So when I introduce my topic with others, when I discuss this, I think that maybe it makes it a little bit easier for people because it doesn't seem so occult or so naive by today's conventions to talk about spiritual practices in this way. But I would say that psychoanalysis has as bad a reputation perhaps as occultism, at least in the United States. And so I don't know that anybody likes to hear about my topic. But no, I'm kidding. I think it has received a good reception, so I'm happy with it.
When you're thinking about framing this work, could you summarize sort of how you decided to go about it? Because obviously you're dealing with questions of women and their representation historically and today. You're dealing with psychoanalysis and various sort of theoretical ways of approaching it. And then you're dealing with spiritualism. So you have a number of sort of things in play. How did you decide ultimately to put it together What was sort of your main thread throughout the book, would you say?
Yeah, my book makes two contributions, the way I see it, to the current state of scholarship. The first one is the study of female mediumship, which hasn't been done in Canada until now, at least as far as I know. So this was the first contribution that I wanted to make. So this contribution, of course, is historical. This is why I visited many archives, and this is where I sort of became myself the medium in a way, trying to retrieve these voices that I felt were lost and that I felt had made an important contribution to Canadian histories, whether these women mediums were writing or speaking in public seances or writing books or performing with scientists, for instance, in ectoplasmic seances, or even advising prime ministers like Mackenzie King, for instance. These women authors were making a historical contribution that hadn't been brought forward, in my opinion. So this was the first contribution of my book. The second one was approaching this question of authorship. This contribution is where I relied on psychoanalysis and feminist criticism to really think about those oblique ways where women are, in my opinion, with female mediumship, we're sort of an in-between in the spectrum from hysteria to feminism, right? As Showalter talks about it, hysteria is sort of a proto-feminist movement. And with mediumship, I had the impression that we were in a sort of in-between. These women are still not capable of saying, I am the subject position of this discourse and I make a claim to knowledge. Yet at the same time, there is a rebellion towards the symbolic. There's a rebellion towards, or a resistance towards this notion that women should not be put in a place of authority and legitimate knowledge. And so for me, this was interesting, this sort of middle ground, and I wanted to explore it in more details through psychoanalysis and feminist criticism. So I would say that these two threads are my main contribution, but how do they connect? It's through an interest in saying, what do women say? How are they being listened to? And how have they contributed to our history, our modern history?
Well, and I guess that opens up a couple things I wanted to ask you about. But first, maybe we could talk about the difference between the sort of physical chapters that you talk about, so the ectoplasm and the photography and that kind of thing, as well as the sort of more opaque ways and like tapping or knocking or things that are not part of the woman's body, perhaps. So like you do have chapters about women speaking what they seem to be hearing or channeling, and then you have women who are physically presenting things like ectoplasm. I'm wondering if there's a difference or if you treat those the same in terms of authorship, or if you can say a little bit about how you distinguish sort of the words that they're saying compared to the physical manifestations you're talking about.
Yes, the chapters are divided. I have various chapters on femininity and authorship among Canadian mediums. And so these chapters are divided into healing, writing, speaking, and performing. In healing, I looked into mediums who became doctors, some of them the first doctors that this country had seen. So healing through possession, and writing about their medical practice through possession. In writing, I talked about Susanna Moody, for instance, a famous Canadian author who had dabbled into spiritualism and written a journal with her husband through automatic writing. Then in speaking, I talked about public seances and mediums in the public sphere. And finally, in performing, I looked into mediums, sciences, and the photographic or physical aspect of mediumship, especially that occurred in the early 20th century in Canada. And so looking at the creation of ectoplasms. And so we see that there was an evolution in spiritualism from the mid-19th century to the interwar in Canada and in the United States. So spiritualism began with raps and knocks that the Fox sisters had heard. And by the 20th century, there were a lot of different forms of seances with ectoplasms, for instance, this sort of substance that was coming out of women's bodies and that was often photographed by scientific researchers who were at the seance table. And so my claim, and it's a claim that has been made by other authors as well, is that seances and spiritualism reflected the popular imagination of media technologies as well. So when we see in 1848 the seances of the Fox sisters, this happened only 4 years after the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse. And we see that these seances really reflected the imagination of the telegraph, and the women's bodies became, in a way, a mirror for those machines. And so a lot of the spiritualist literature at the time talks about female mediums as some sort of telegraph, communicating the voices of the spirits through these knocks. Then you have automatic writing, you have vocal forms of possessions where the mediums are saying what the spirits are saying themselves, so this actual possession. But in the 20th century, with the development of cameras that can be used by the middle class more easily, then you have changes through the practices that are used at the seance table. And scientists and observers are now able to capture, or they try to capture, the spiritual manifestations in different ways. Photography, of course, was also present in the mid-19th century. You have a lot of spiritual photographs or spirit photographs. But by the 20th century, these photographs are more concerned with the female medium's bodies. And perhaps this reflects as well new developments in the field of gynecology. But what we see is that these photographs are now very interested in seeing how materials can be produced by mediums' bodies. And what I thought was really interesting in Canada and in the United States was how sexualized these images were, where you see ectoplasms coming out of women's orifices, and literally all orifices, and how the scientists are fascinated by this bizarre capacity of particularly women's bodies to be a vehicle for dead matters. And so in this chapter, I ask myself, how can medical discourse see women in this way? And what did the female mediums provide in this discourse? What did they say? Were they resisting this discourse that was objectifying their bodies in a way, but also seeing their bodies as this mystical form of in-between, between life and death? So how are they resisting? How are they compliant? And looking into what happens to this discourse of agency when these mediums are discussing with scientists.
One thing that usually comes up frequently, I guess, in terms of people who read your work and then comment on it, is this one woman, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name exactly, who is producing rabbits, right? She's effectively giving birth to rabbits. Can you say a little bit more about how that might work?
No, I forgot all about that. But that was like the Renaissance thing. It's not in my book.
Really? No, that's totally in your book. You're totally lying. You talk about a woman who like produces rabbits. No?
No, not in my book.
Someone else's book, maybe?
I talked about that at a conference.
I thought it was in your book, too.
No.
All right, well, maybe we'll have to cut this part.
Yep.
But these ectoplasms are clearly not... Well, I mean, I guess you say that you want to keep a distance from it, but can you really look at the ectoplasms being produced and assume that they are from the spirit world? Or how do you suspend disbelief? Or how do you approach these really out-of-this-world claims that women are suddenly giving birth to sort of ghost forms?
There have been different forms of scholarship on ectoplasm. Some authors do suspend beliefs. Some do try to demonstrate how the fraud, if you will, was done. Harry Houdini was one, as you know, who was famous for going to seances and demonstrating the trickery that these mediums were using. I think for me it's pretty clear, because of my approach to spiritualism, that I don't believe in this, and I don't see the point in suspending belief or pretending that I suspend belief if I do not believe in it, right? But I also don't spend time looking into how the trickery might have been implemented. What interests me instead is, again, this question of discourse and this question of authority for women. Why would women want to do something like that? I don't think that it's just to attract attention or to gain financial reward only. I think that there's something much more profound in place. And to me, it's this idea that women want to be heard, they want to be seen, and they want to be literally at the table with scientists, with people who have received an education, with people who have a claim to authority in their discourse, and they want to be set in an equal position towards them. At the same time, in a weird turn of fate, it also means getting naked, being evaluated, objectified by a scientific medical discourse. When you look at the photographs of these seances, these women are often tied to their chairs. They're often performing naked to make sure that there's no tricks being used or fraud being used. So it's a very, very bizarre and contradictory mode of entering discourse. But at the same time, I do think that there is this genuine intention of being heard by these women. And it's interesting because the seances become a little bit carnivalesque as well in those early 20th century ectoplasm seances. Because from what I've seen, from what I've discovered in the archives of such seances, you would often see the spirits say to these really, really renowned medical doctors, Nobel Prize winners, etc., order them to do certain undignified things. Like, for instance, in Canada, Thomas Glenn Hamilton was being asked by the spirits to sing at the top of his voice Jingle Bells in the middle of the summer. So this is just one example, but Thomas Glenn Hamilton, of course, was the president of the Medical Association of Canada. So you see again a reversal of positions of power at the table, and this is what really interests me first and foremost.
So then, when I hear this question of authorship, maybe it's just me, but the first thing I think of is Foucault's "What is an author?" And he makes certain claims about how the author functions. The title of author functions in different ways, and according to certain social hierarchies, and also ways of organizing thought and materials. Do you like Foucault's approach to authorship, or is there a better approach to authorship that you've found? I know Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault are the first two that I think about, maybe just because of my experience and what I've read. Who do you use primarily, would you say, both in the book and maybe in your own mind, in terms of deciding what authorship means, and how do they help you do that?
Yeah, to me, Foucault was really helpful in thinking about how an author is born, or what are these practices through which we define what an author is. Especially, we've been talking about cataloging practices in libraries, for instance. So who was seen as the author? Was it the female medium? Was it the male authority who sat with her at the seance table? Was it the spirit? One example that I could give to talk about practices of authorship and how they are defined within larger discourses as well is Annie-Florence Schmitt. She's one of the mediums that I explore in this book. And so she has published 2 books that are now at the Toronto Library. And one of the books, for instance, I'll just talk about one, is written by a spirit named Spiritus. And his real name from life was Arthur Rogers. So Florence Schmitt is saying that she's being possessed by this spirit who had lived a life under a male name and then went into the spirit sphere, took on a nom de plume to become a writer, and then told his story to, according to him, give a lesson to other men. And it's interesting, actually, because the lesson is to treat their wives more carefully. But then when I went to this library to find this archive, I saw that the author of the book was named as Spiritus. So if you want to find this book, you have to look for the spirit's name. Then there is a preface to the book that is written by Ernst John Craigie, who was a sitter among the medium circle. And basically what he says is, this work, I can promise you, has truly been written by the spirit and therefore is worth reading. And so the way the author is born, the way the author is cataloged through these practices is that you will only see the names pretty much Spiritus, Arthur Rogers, or John Craigie into the library cataloging system. And you have to really, really look through the inside of the book to find at some point that the medium was Annie-Florence Schmitt, that the way she wrote, she had a little box, and that the spirit would knock on the box every time a letter from the alphabet was recited by the audience. So you can imagine how lengthy such a process would have been. There's about 200 pages of text written by this method. You really don't see her as an author until very, very much later. And then is she the author, or is it part of a collaborative practice at the seance table? because when the letters were, when there was a knock corresponding to a letter, then somebody would write the letter down. And then afterwards, Ernst John Craigie, who wrote the preface, would also look at all the sentences together and correct them if he saw that there was, according to him, a mistake, these kinds of things. So it's really hard to find this one author at the origin of the book. The author is already multiple. And I think that this is where Foucault's notion of authorship as a social construct, as a result of a discursive practice, is very interesting.
Maybe it's just the fact that I was teaching this the other day, Janice Radway's Reading the Romance. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that one. But she sort of positions, I guess one of the criticisms of her book, Reading the Romance, was that she tries to position women who are reading sort of Harlequin romance novels as proto-feminists, is some of the terms that were used sort of against her, because she seems to make an argument that while the average person might see these women as not contributing to a feminist discourse, they actually are almost at that level if you look close enough. And so, again, I'm not necessarily saying that that's how she did it, or that at all that that's how you're doing it, but there is this idea sort of that these are hidden feminist practices that you're bringing to light. I'm wondering if you see it at all like that, or if you see it in a completely different way. Are these spiritualists and women mediums, are they feminists? Are they proto-feminists? Or are they significantly different from what we would consider feminism today? How do you view that connection?
It's a difficult question. The way I see them, these women were not necessarily intending to be feminists in the sense that they intended to change the world, right? They did, however, change discursive practices. And in fact, I do think that they opened the way for modernist forms of writings, for forms of writings that were different than what we saw in the early 19th century. They opened the way for a form of discourse that was much more collaborative, that was not purely linear, in which the I didn't stand at the middle of discourse. Virginia Woolf talks about, I really love her citation in A Room of One's Own, where she talks about reading novels by this Mr. A. She calls him Mr. A. And she says that after reading a few novels by Mr. A, you begin to be tired to see this straight, dark bar that is shaped like the letter I. And she says in the shadow of that I, there is nothing. You can only see a blur because it's so predominant. And I think that mediums open the way to modernist forms of writing that go outside of this I at the center of all discourse. They're challenging this form of authorship that Virginia Woolf, Irigaray, and other feminist critiques would consider to be a masculine I, a masculine subject position in discourse. So whether or not they intended to propose a feminist project, I think they did change discourse in a way that led to a possibility for many other women to write and to speak publicly and to practice within fields that were not already open to them. At the same time, there were some mediums who very interestingly did preach feminism very openly. In my book, an example of this is Flora MacDonald Dennison, who was a radical feminist in Canada, but who also was very interested in spiritualism and found in spiritualism a way to internally validate her radical feminist ideas. Another interesting aspect of this is if you ever read Anne Broad, she has a book called Radical Spirits, where she talks about around 800 women who practice spiritualism in the United States, many of them in public seances that gathered thousands of people, and who would make claims through spiritual possession that were feminists in themselves. So, for instance, the male spirits would come talk to the audience and say that women should have the right to vote, that women should have the right to have an education, etc. And so it's a spectrum, right? The spiritual mediums did not necessarily define themselves as feminists. Some of them had views that were very conservative. But overall, as a movement, it did change our notions of agency and the appropriation of discourse in a way that I think opened the way for new forms of writing, for new forms of speaking. And these new forms were more open to hearing what women had to say, or more open to hearing marginalized voices.
I'd like to move into a little bit more of the practical side of this. I know you were fortunate and deserving to get a postdoc grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, I believe is what it's called. It's been a while. The SSHRC grant for postdoctoral research. So I know that during that period, you were traveling to, like I said, Geneva, Geneva, Paris, Toronto, Ottawa, maybe some other places I'm forgetting. Do you have advice for people who want to do this kind of research, not necessarily on spiritualism, but things that take place throughout the world potentially or are archived throughout the world and that may have some issues in terms of referencing exactly who is the author and how to find that material? What was your experience like locating material for this? Because your book has obviously a lot of material, including photographs and quotations and citations that you've collected. Do you have any advice for people? Can you tell us a bit about your experience and what you would recommend doing if anyone were to take on a project at all similar?
It was very difficult, and I'm sure that I missed a ton of work. And so I hope that people do continue to look into archives to find these works that have been either misattributed or attributed to someone else, where we could still retrieve the voices of real women, for instance, or real marginalized voices. I don't know that I necessarily have tricks or advice to give, but I can recognize that for me, my job was made much easier by the fact that in Canada, in Europe, and in the United States, we're seeing a much greater number of digitalized archives. And so it was easier for me to look from home to see what these archives were holding and then only visit them if I knew that there would be a few things that would be available. But librarians were also extremely helpful. Every time I had questions, I really relied on librarians and archivists, and so many of them had really in-depth knowledge of the archives that they held, and they would let me really play with them. So, for instance, one archivist gave me the boxes and documents that belonged to Susanna Moody, and there was even a lock of her hair that I could touch. And so I would say even when you think you find enough archives digitally available, still go, because you don't know what the materials will hold and the difference that you will find in touching this physical material and sometimes talking to the archivist and discovering more than you thought.
Was there anything in the process of looking into this historical movement and thinking through it through a number of different theoretical approaches, primarily, like you said, feminist criticism and psychoanalysis? Was there anything that changed your mind or surprised you along the way? Or I'm curious whether you sort of had an idea of authorship, spiritualism, and mediumship that perhaps was confirmed in the research you did? Or was there something that you started with and something that you finished that was significantly different?
One thing that really surprised me as I did this work was I thought I would use psychoanalysis as a framework for myself to understand possession voices or spiritual voices as stemming from the medium's unconscious. So I thought psychoanalysis would only serve as a framework for me. And then I realized doing this research that the first psychologists of the unconscious actually discovered the unconscious through their studies of mediumship. So this was something completely unexpected to me at the beginning of this research. This idea that psychoanalysis was much more than a framework. It was born from this historical movement in a way. And so this is something that I'm hoping to research more in the future. The fact that 19th century psychologists, especially in Europe, studied mediums and what they did with it, which I find really surprising. So, for instance, Pierre Janet is a well-known psychologist who studied under Jean-Martin Charcot, who was close to Freud and his theories in a sense, and who developed ideas about the unconscious, notably idées fixes and things like that. And he did his PhD dissertation on a medium or a psychic who claimed to be able to understand telepathically certain commands that were given to her at a distance. And so Pierre Janet would be at a distance from her and give her commands like, turn on the light in the room right now, or write down this word on a piece of paper. And he found that many of the commands that he gave, surprisingly, were actually being completed by the mediums. So it made him believe in the reality of telepathy in his work, in his PhD dissertation. But then he completely moved away from the occult in his later work and completely rejected any kind of possibility of the occult. And we see something similar in Sigmund Freud, who is always seen as being this very skeptical psychologist, psychoanalyst, but who himself studied telepathy and did believe in telepathy and published about it and made experiments where he defined himself as the medium. So this was a connection that I did not expect and that I hope to explore more in the future.
The fact that you say psychoanalysis, in a sense, was born out of these observations of mediumship, I think is really profound, and obviously with another book, which I think is what I hope you're doing.
I agree.
Can you say a little bit more, though, about what you mean and where you hope to take that?
This is why you and I visited, as you mentioned, archives in Geneva. One of the mediums that I'm thinking about is Helen Schmitt, who lived in Geneva and who in the late 19th century started seances that were attended by some of the most renowned intellectuals of her community in Geneva. So her seances were attended by Theodore Flournoy, who was the chair of experimental psychology at the University of Geneva at the time. He attended her seances for 5 years, and he even invited Ferdinand de Saussure, famous linguist, as you know, who came to study the seances as well. And what interested them, these authors, is that Helen Schmitt was not very highly educated. In fact, she didn't finish her high school education. She was a clerk at a clothing store. But under Trance, she was extremely artistic. She could make beautiful drawings and paintings. And most amazingly of all things, she was able to invent many, many languages. So she invented a Martian language and alphabet. She invented what she called an ultra-Martian and alphabet. There was a language from Uranus. There was a language from what she considered it a Hindu language. It wasn't, but it was very close to it and close enough to fool her observers, her scientific observers. And Saussure, who was an Orientalist at the time, did come to the seance to study this quote-unquote Hindu language and think about this. So this is the kind of research that I'm doing. I'm trying to see what a medium like Helen Schmitt, what kind of role did a medium like Helen Schmitt play in the development of psychology. Flournoy published his book called From India to the Planet Mars. That was read by many psychologists at the time. If I remember correctly, I believe Freud had this book in his library. Carl Jung corresponded with Flournoy and did his PhD dissertation through the influence of Flournoy on a medium himself. So I'm trying to retrieve these women. I'm trying to retrieve the lives of these women and create a new history or reframe our historical narrative. Because we often see psychology of the unconscious as being born out of a discourse on the hysteric. And I want to see what kind of origins we find for this discipline if we look at its origin, if we look for the female medium.
Well, could you say a little bit more? Do you think that is an origin, or how are you framing that? Like, are you seeing it sort of as a genealogy, like a Foucauldian genealogy? Do you see yourself doing more, perhaps digging under the surface? I mean, I guess there are different metaphors you could use or different theories you could use to approach this. But how are you approaching this in terms of tracing back the history that now, with your work and others, would incorporate sort of missing pieces? Are you filling in a puzzle? Are you digging below the surface? Are you doing a sort of a genealogy? How do you see your work? Is there a metaphor you use to understand it?
I see what you mean. And perhaps, I don't mean that there is some kind of ultimate origin in unconscious psychology or dynamic psychiatry. And I'm not trying to say that finding these female mediums, these occult voices will rectify history and that I'm reaching a truer history. So what I'm thinking instead is constructing a different narrative. I would say this is possibly the metaphor that I'm using. I see history as a multitude of narratives. And by finding these women and by seeing the roles that they played in the development of psychology, by looking at their lives, I want to create a new narrative that adds to our historical knowledge.
in terms of what you've seen since, what most interests you about the field in general? Because, I mean, like I said before, you're part of, if you consider this book in particular, you're part of a number of fields now, and you are fitting in different ways, of course. Where do you hope some or all of these fields will go in the next few years, maybe the next few decades? I mean, your work is tracing back a little bit more about the influence of these women on psychoanalysis and other fields. Where do you hope other work will lead?
What do you mean?
What are you hoping other researchers find that will perhaps assist you or pull or push you in different directions? I mean, you are tracing back these women who may have had a greater influence than anybody potentially realized. What else do you hope scholars are doing, though, in relation to that, or separately from that?
I don't care what scholars are doing.
Comedy Hour with Dr. Massicotte now.
One of the things that I hope people, and I do think that there is a movement in scholarship going in that direction. But a few years ago, for instance, Michel Onfray was very critical of Sigmund Freud because, and this was one of the main arguments of Michel Onfray, because Freud was interested in occultism and because Freud was interested in the field of telepathy, for this author, this meant that psychoanalysis was not a valuable critical framework. And to me, this is very interesting, this idea that if an author has some kind of interest in the occult, that his philosophies, his theories, his science, if you want to call psychoanalysis a science, is invalidated automatically. I think that as I look into the role of the occult at the origins or within the genealogy of modern psychology, I hope that scholars will not see this as a way to dismiss the value of the unconscious as some kind of occult invention, but as part of a history where authors have tried to understand what are these voices that we hear in our heads, what are these voices that spiritual mediums were hearing, what are the multiplicities of selves that constitute us? How do we relate to one another? How can sometimes we understand what another person is saying or means to say without saying a word to us? And so the occult, to me, even though it's not something that personally I believe in, I do not think that it invalidates psychological theories in any ways or the theories of the unconscious that I'm researching in any ways. And so I think that there's a lot of scholarship now being done, for instance, by psychoanalysts looking into, just to give you an example among many others, Freud's research on telepathy. And this work is at the opposite of what Michel Onfray does. What they're showing is that Freud's interest in telepathy is actually at the origin of his ideas of transference and countertransference, at the origins or in the genealogy of what we call today relational psychoanalysis, these kinds of things, or intersubjective psychoanalysis. I hope that more scholarship continues to be done in this way, where the occult is not seen as this invalidating moment in any kind of history or genealogy of a scientific discipline.
No, I like that. And I just want to point out how funny it is that you just said something like they are doing research when you're totally referring to you.
I'm not. I promise I'm not.
Well, you and your colleagues in France, I believe, they're both in France, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I assume that a man who is asked that question would kind of automatically say, well, I'm doing research on Freud and telepathy and the influence and the sort of blacklisting of that part of his life, whereas you totally just said they, and no one other than me and other people who have read that know that you're talking about yourself.
Well, that is true. No, but I am collaborating with two authors, Thomas Rabeyron and Évrard Renaud. And we've published a little bit on Freud and telepathy, but there are many, many other authors. Julia Gimesi is one of them. Deborah Kuhn is another one of them. So there are many, many authors doing this kind of research that I think is really tremendous. But you're right. I think I am a medium myself.
That's really funny and interesting. And I guess it shows, well, I don't know. Do you think that it reflects you having done this work, or do you think that you might have done this work because it reflects a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, perhaps. Absolutely. I've been raised, like many other women I know, I've been raised to be modest, to be told that I sound arrogant if I say I did this, or, to consider myself that I should be humble in some way. And perhaps this PhD research had to do with what does it mean to be a female academic, to embrace a discourse of authority, a discourse of power, to become a professor, an academic, a scholar, and to see how other women had done so before me.
I was going to ask you one other question about why the work on authorship and women historically and contemporary is important, but I think you sort of answered that in what you just said, which is that there are many women in the academy.
The imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah, who have the imposter syndrome, or who have either they have problems themselves in terms of how they talk about their work because they may worry that they seem to be bragging or they seem to be conceited, that a lot of men clearly don't have.
I know you don't.
Yeah, no. But at the same time, a lot of people who may say the same thing potentially as a man, as they've shown in certain studies with teaching evaluations, for example, will be judged in a way that is more intense or is, I guess, condemning of somebody who is female for having the appearance of being, bossy or conceited or something that a male subject doesn't necessarily have. So it's interesting how this work fits into that, which is not necessarily apparent for somebody who picks up the book and sees that it's about spiritualism. But I think that's the thread that I think would make it interesting to people in broader ways, and would speak to an even broader discourse than the more narrow one on spiritualism and the history of that.
Absolutely, like you said, and I think this goes beyond women as well, right? It's what interested me in this book is how can marginalized voices be heard, and spiritualism was one strategy among many others through which a community, a group of subjects who were being marginalized, managed to make themselves heard at a certain period in time.
Yeah, which can speak to a number of things, I think, beyond spiritualism. I mean, that gives us a lot to think about. Hopefully, whoever is listening and has read your book, or who hasn't and might want to pick it up. Again, it's Dr. Claudie Massicotte speaking on her book, Trance Speakers, Femininity and Authorship in Spiritual Seances, 1850 to 1930. Thanks so much for doing this interview. I appreciate it. I've been asking you for a long time. I finally got you to agree, and I do appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of other people do as well.
Thank you